Hello and welcome to my little passion project in which I aim to combine my love of travelling and my love of whisky by looking at those whiskies that you can find whilst on your travels. Why am I doing this? It's simply because I enjoy it and I hope it might help others find that deep pleasure and appreciation when having a whisky on their travels. So far, I've been heavily influenced by the whiskies that I have found whilst on board celebrity cruise ships. That happens to be the cruise line that I have sailed on the most, but this time I'm going to look elsewhere. Both Morella and Ambassador cruise ships offer a different selection of drinks than Celebrity does. The two former ones being UK relevant rather than Celebrity, which is more USA led. I want to look at a whisky that's been mentioned in previous episodes, but I know that it deserves its own spot. The whisky is Famous Grouse, and just the name alone is worth talking about. On the whole, it could be said that single malts tend to be named after the distillery, which is related to its location. Even if the specific expression has a name, it is still usually linked to the place. Corryvreckan, for example, one of my all-time favourites, is actually known as Ardbeg's Corryvreckan. There are exceptions, of course, but they are usually when others get involved, such as when a supermarket wants to have its own label. There are advantages to this. It helps prevent the distillery undercutting its own sales. It gives the supermarket a sense of uniqueness, and it also allows the supermarket to change the distillery to an alternative one while still using the same branding. On the other hand, blends are often known by a person's name. Bells, Teachers, Johnny Walker, Dewars, etc. Again, there are exceptions, such as Cutty Sark, as featured in a previous episode. The reason I raise this is that a name says a lot. It can be a reflection on how the brand began. The single malts began from a specific place and will be referred to as that name. This could become quite heated when more than one distillery operates within the same area. See the Glenlivet episode for an example. Many blends began in a completely different way. Their beginnings were not at the distillery, but within a merchant's premises. Sometimes this could be as small as a single shop. As a result, it was the reputation of the shop owner that enabled the customer to trust the contents of the bottle. This means that the shopkeeper had to try and maintain standards and conformity at a time when supplies may not be as reliable as they would have liked. The way around this would have been to mix the casks together. This could be through a natural process. In an age when people would bring their own vessels to be filled from a tapped cask, it would be understandable for that cask to get reused or to be topped up, creating a form of blending. Or they might get creative and purposefully make a reproducible blend, and by doing so they are able to smooth out differences and anomalies and manage to create a profile that met the requirements of their customers. But these shopkeepers were not distillers, so how did they know what to do? The answer is in the term transferable skills. Shopkeepers were not just doing this with whisky. They had experience in mixing and blending other things, such as wine and tea. They had acquired a sense of smell and taste and had an awareness of the preferences of their customers that put them in the best position to produce a good blend suited to those customer needs. And if they couldn't, then they were not successful, and so that brand would not carry on. It is simply a matter of survival of the most fit. The origin of Famous Grouse comes from such a venture. A small but trusted grocer shop that moved into Athol Street in Perth in 1807 and was owned by John Brown. Then a Matthew Gloag, I say a Matthew Gloag as there's going to be quite a few of them mentioned, married John's daughter, Margaret. Margaret took over the business in 1824 and she obtained a license to sell snuff, wines and spirits in 1831. Meanwhile, Matthew had been managing the cellar of the local sheriff and had developed experience in dealing and handling wine. When Queen Victoria visited Perth, it was Matthew who they came to source the wines for the event. With a rising trend in whisky, the ability to blend more and grain whiskies together, and a trusted position of good reputation, it would make perfect sense to make his own brand. This happened in 1897, but it was not the same Matthew. He had died in 1860. Neither was it his son, William, who became a shareholder in the North British distillery, but it was his grandson, who was also called Matthew. This Matthew took control in 1896 and began to produce blended whiskies. The first was the Brig of Perth, which is no longer available. And the following year, in 1897, he introduced the Grouse. When I first began the Malted Muse podcast all those years ago, I had the idea of trying to match whisky with experiences and stories. One of my favourite questions was, which whisky goes best with a bonfire, a walk, a day on the beach, etc.? In a way, Matthew was having a similar thought. I bottled a 15-year-old Tobermory single cask at cask strength and labelled it as the home calling, because I attached the experience of being called home at the end of work or from travel by the prospect of having a glass of it. Matthew wanted a whisky that he felt matched the experience of a day in the wonderful countryside around him. And so he named it after the well-known and iconic bird that inhabited that countryside, the grouse. This is also fitting well with the intention for it to be appealing to those engaged within a certain sporting activity. In a way, this could be ironic. I mentioned earlier that a lot of blended whiskies are named after a person, and this one isn't. However, the name Gloag, when from the Irish roots, can mean famous. But this doesn't work when the origin is Scottish, when it can mean gloom or darkness. The whisky was named to reflect the pleasure Matthew got from the countryside around him. And it was his daughter, Philippa Gloag, known affectionately as the woman behind the wings, and the inspiration for a limited edition bottling, who actually did the original drawing that went on the label of the bottle. The timeline of Grouse whisky is where some confusion can be found. According to many sources, including the brand's own website, the Grouse became very popular to the point that it changed its name to the Famous Grouse in 1905. However, in Charles MacLean's book, Famous for a Reason, The Story of Famous Grouse, he states that the Famous Grouse was introduced a year after Grouse was launched and was different to it, with it being softer and more mellow, with a guaranteed age of 8 years. Despite being called a deluxe whisky, it was sold alongside the Grouse, but on a lower price point than the Grouse. This later changed, with the Famous Grouse becoming the more expensive of the two, and then the Grouse becoming an extinct species. Or did it? I couldn't find any information saying when the production of Grouse stopped, other than one reference to it being about 10 years later. I have wondered if it's possible that it was the Famous Grouse that was discontinued, that the Grouse was renamed, they swapped the names. In other words, did Grouse take on the name Famous Grouse and then the previous Famous Grouse be abandoned? Jump forward to 2022 and the launch of another blend in the series. Initially available online only, it had the odd name of the famous one, a sweeter blend than the famous Grouse, which reminds me of how the famous Grouse was described in relation to the Grouse. I find it strange that the well-known famous Grouse may have originally been called the Grouse and then became famous, and now there is a lesser known version named the famous one, when the real famous one is not that one but the famous Grouse, which is not the same as the Grouse, and that the famous one is more like the original famous Grouse before the name was passed to the Grouse and the original famous Grouse was discontinued. Maybe. I have nothing to say that any of this is correct, but it's just a thought that I have occasionally. I'm waiting for famous Grouse to respond on this topic, and I'll give an update in the YouTube description if and when that happens. It is just a thought. Jumping back to our timeline, how he did this in the sense of what the mix was his secret recipe, and one that has been passed down through the generations and is still used today. But it is worth giving some thought about what is meant by recipe. If I was to make a simple batter for Yorkshire puddings, I would know what quantities of flour, milk and eggs to use. The chances are that the mix would be the same as what my mother and her mother used. But whiskey is not Yorkshire puddings. To begin with, the recipe of a blend is much more than just 3 ingredients. Secondly, the ingredients are not consistent. To make a good blend, one has to select the appropriate whiskies, often 40 or more different ones. You need to know which mix with which and in what order to mix them. You need to know how to marry them and mature them afterwards. But one cask of whiskey can be different to another cask from the same distillery. So the blender has to be aware of the condition of the casks, monitoring them and selecting them. There may also be a number of problems, such as what happens if a distillery is no longer available, if trade deals change in the supply, or a distillery goes out of business, or changes the profile of the whiskey. The role of the blender has changed. When Matthew Gloag III formulated the recipe for Grouse whiskey, he did so with great skill. But, without wanting to boast, if you gave me enough time and enough whiskies, even I could eventually make a decent blend. What I would not be able to do is to maintain and repeat it with consistency for over 130 years. That requires an expert team to check casks at around 80,000 times a year and nose around 600 samples a day. Whilst the whiskey industry faced many challenges and downturns, many of which are discussed in my YouTube series Talking Whiskey and the episode entitled Timeline of Scotch Whiskey, the Gloag business had such esteemed customers and diverse quality products that they managed to see those times through to the other side. In 1908, a period when the whiskey world was facing dilemmas of definition, the Grouse whiskey managed to obtain a certificate of purity from the Institute of Hygiene, meaning that it was then argued that should a doctor wish to prescribe a whiskey for medicinal reasons, then they would be advised to prescribe the Grouse. In addition to this, they added 2 more blends to their whiskey portfolio, one called the anti-gout whiskey and another the anti-diabetic whiskey. Over time, the business has had a few Matthews. The first was Matthew Gloag I, then his son William Gloag, before returning to another Matthew. This was the son of William's brother, Matthew Gloag II. No other than Matthew Gloag III, who was followed by his son, Matthew William Gloag, and then by his son, Matthew Frederick Gloag, who suffered a fatal heart attack on the 11th of January 1970. He had spent his last years worried about his wife's health, who had had cancer. She also dies just 3 days after him. His son, Matthew Irving Gloag, who had joined the business in 1965, aged just 17, now took control of the business in his early 20s. He faced immediate challenges. At this point, Harold Wilson was coming to the end of his time as Prime Minister and would be beaten in the next election by Ted Heath later that year. Estate duty on properties over £10,000 was running at 30%, and on top of this, the Gloag family had to face death duties for both parents at the same time. It was a major challenge that had not been expected and rested on the shoulders of a grieving, inexperienced and new director. This led to the business being sold to Highland Distillers Limited, later on to become Edrington. It was a good fit in many ways, as Highland Distillers' portfolio included some of the distilleries that had been supplying Matthew Gloag and Sons with whisky for some time. Matthew Irving Gloag had been mainly focused on the wine side of the business, and now, despite the business being sold, he wanted to keep the family connection. He joined the board of directors and began an accelerated apprenticeship into the whisky side of the business. Eventually, he found himself leading the area of brand sponsorship, which had a clear emphasis on a wide variety of sports and events, including a taxidermy competition, and help establish the brand in key and new markets. Highland's vast distribution network boosted the position of famous Grouse to the point that it became the most popular Scotch in Scotland and eventually for the UK, but was also expanded more into the international market. But it was more significant than this. The whisky industry is known to be fluctuating. It takes time to make whisky, and whilst it matures, the world can change. Some of these changes, such as World War and Prohibition, affect everyone, but others don't. Changes in trend, for example, can hit one part of an industry, but not others. During the late 70s and onwards, there was a move away from blended whisky and towards the emerging market for single malts. It was also a time when some were moving away from dark spirits and finding a preference for other drinks, such as clear, white spirits. This had the effect that those focused on whisky would face a difficult period, whilst those with diverse portfolios were able to reap the benefits of emerging markets. This, along with other factors, led for an increase in the formation of mega companies within the drinks business. Smaller distilleries were being acquired to form companies such as Highland Distillers Limited, but big companies were then buying them up to form these mega groups. This nearly happened to Highland when Hiram Walker, the large Canadian company, made moves upon Highland. By working alongside others and with political assistance, Highland Distillers managed to keep control and defended itself in ways that Matthew Gloag and Sons would not have been able to do on their own. Instead, famous Grouse was given a new lease of life and was awarded a royal warrant in 1984. It was also part of a landmark legal case in 1998 when it took a lead in action against Welsh Distillers Limited. At the time, Welsh Distillers Limited had launched two blends, Soonamore, meaning Sound of the Sea, and Prince of Wales, both labelled as being Welsh whiskies. In truth, they were blended Scotch whiskies that had been filtered through Welsh herbs. Matthew Gloag and Sons made the argument that this was a form of passing off and was unfair trading. The famous Grouse had had a virtual relaunch, along with new artwork by Roger MacPhail and a new slogan, "Quality in the Age of Change." Under Edrington's ownership, the brand began to expand, with other versions coming onto the market. The first of these was in 2006 with the Black Grouse, a peated grouse. Then in 2008 they released a blended grain whisky called the Snow Grouse. The trend for spacing these new editions with 2-year intervals was repeated in 2010 when a higher-end blended malt grouse was released under the name the Naked Grouse, which, if you think about it, is quite a plucky name. But this was by no means all. A massive range of differing variations were also released, catering for all tastes and raising the profile of the distilleries involved. This appeared to include a very different version called the Famous Goose. Inspired by the migratory Canadian goose, it was launched as an April Fool's Day joke, but was never actually made. They have also released bottles that clearly illustrate how blended whisky can also be whiskies of status, such as the 40-year-old blended malt, which was a limited release and sells for between £2,000 to £3,000 a bottle. They also set a world record for the largest bottle of Scotch whisky in 2012, standing at 5 feet and 5 inches tall and holding 228 litres of whisky. It was a world record that was then broken in 2021 by Macallan. In addition to this was the now closed Famous Grouse experience at Glentullett Distillery, which was an award-winning visitors centre set in Scotland's oldest distillery and was mentioned in my episode about Glentullett. In January 2022, Matthew Irving Globe passed away. He continued to believe in the product and was a significant part of its history. During one interview, he made what I find an interesting comment. I have often said, don't underestimate blends, but he took it further. In the interview, he expressed the view that he wasn't a malt drinker and that you could never be sure of what you were getting. There isn't a star rating for malt whisky, and there is a vast variety between distilleries, ages and expressions. He even suggested that it was dead easy to make and stick it in the bottle. Blends, on the other hand. In July 2025, the Famous Grouse brand was acquired by William Grant & Sons. This came with a statement of plans to build on its reputation even further, with specific mention of the Naked Grouse. At time of recording, it's still early days to see how this develops, but the Famous Grouse has a long enough and interesting enough history already to be worth spending a moment in appreciation of it while sat at the bar on a cruise. Recently on Facebook, I was asking people about whiskies on cruise ships, and somebody made the comment that they like malt whiskies because they like their whiskies to have a story. Well, my response to that is have a good look at blends. Blends require an incredible amount of skill. They were absolutely vital in helping the whisky industry survive hard times. These blends, they have stories as well, and the Famous Grouse is but one of those stories. Enjoy.